Greetings once again from St. Anthony Parish. For those of you who are still at home and may still be self-quarantining, we will be rotating, at least for the next few weeks, back and forth between my weekly bulletin articles and these little video casts in an attempt to try to present reflections and things of that nature to those of you who might still be at home, as well as to try to keep you up on some current events. Now, of course, I do want to assure all of you that St. Anthony's is still here. While we have resumed our normal liturgical schedule, we are still doing so with a limited capacity within the church. Furthermore, we are still asking people, please wear masks when they are in church, especially for the consideration of others. And of course, we are still exercising social distancing to the extent that we are able. For this week's reflection, I was actually contemplating, especially in light of a conversation I have been having with a friend of mine, a lot of the various protests and political demonstrations we've been seeing, especially in the last few weeks, and the outrage over the unfortunate and violent death of George Floyd. And while I would begin by expressing my incredible sympathy toward George Floyd's family, and of course for all those who have been the victims of any sort of police brutality or unjust aggression or repression, I do have to admit that it did bring up an interesting reflection, especially as I'm hearing all these cries from individuals saying that we need to tear down the structures of our society, that we need to tear down our law enforcement, that we need to gut things and start over again. I was reminded of a class that I had taken back in my college days. It was actually a British literature class. And when we were in this class, and I was surrounded by many different college students, most of which were a few years younger than myself, and most of which were very ideological in their thinking, our professor had us read an essay. And it was an essay that was written by a British author shortly after the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with the historical details, a few years after the American Revolution had successfully broken and severed political ties between our country and Britain, there was a revolution that started in France. It was a revolution attempting to overthrow the King of France and the nobility of France, and to try to create a new society of fraternity and equality and democracy in France. All the things that we would typically agree with and that we would wholeheartedly endorse, especially as Americans, who have been taught from our infancy that liberty and democracy and things of this nature are sacrosanct. Of course, this particular essay was rather critical. The author sympathized with some positions of the French people, but he said that as they were in such a hurry to tear down the monarchy, to uproot the nobility, to completely undo the entire legal and power structure of their society, he said they were charging ahead almost blindly. They were almost rushing into the darkness, assuming that anything that organically developed out of this chaos would be more just, more fair, more equitable than whatever oppressive category had been established before it. The author who was writing this essay said that there was no reason to conclude that. He said they were simply tearing down the power structure and creating a vacuum. He said they have no idea what it will be replaced with. They are assuming that as they move forward, whatever they have replaced the old with, the new will be better. This was the doctrine that they were almost embracing universally. And he said that it was very possible that some more tyrannical despot, some worse authoritative figure would simply arise from the ashes to replace whatever tyranny had been there prior. Now, yes, he did make claims that they were violating the divine right of kings and frustrating God's will, but nevertheless, he made an interesting point. He said if we don't have a clear idea of where we're going, we have no reason to conclude that where we are going is better than where we are. One simply cannot advocate for the destruction of what is without a detailed plan of what it is going to be replaced with. Now, of course, when he was finished having us read this essay, the class began an interesting sort of common conversation about what they had read. I imagine I wasn't too shocked when most of these ideological young people began to criticize the essay severely. After all, how dare this author criticize something that moved these people toward a further goal of democracy and equality and fraternity and things of that nature? I mean, how could anyone be this undemocratic? How could anyone be this backwards thinking? And they asked the professor, quite frankly, how this man could hold this position. Now, of course, the professor gave some interesting explanation about how the author was part of the nobility of England, how this was really a self-serving essay, how he was criticizing this revolution in France, largely because he was fearful that a similar revolution might spring up in England, and then of course he could lose his privileged position of power. There may very well have been some historical truth to that. But amongst all the voices in the class, I remember raising my hand and taking the very lonely position of saying, "But aren't we going to give the devil his due here?" The entire class looked at me rather quizzically. "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, he was right. The French Revolution did undo the oppressive monarchy. It did kick out the privileged nobility. But what resulted from it was absolutely unspeakably barbaric. There were public executions in the streets. The guillotine swang and took the head of anyone who was declared an enemy of the revolution, anyone who criticized this new fledgling state. The entire law system was ripped into pieces, and amongst all of this chaos, when stability finally was reestablished, what was given birth to was the new imperial reign of Napoleon, who, of course, in his own thirst for power, marched generations of young Frenchmen into incredibly bloody and costly wars all across Europe and across the known world. Was not what was created as a result of the revolution directly far more destructive and far more painful than anything that the old order had ever established? At least that was what I had argued. Now, of course, the entire classroom kind of eyed me with disdain when I made this point, but I think my argument holds up historically. You can criticize this author's ideas, but he did make a point. One should not simply be so quick to call for the destruction of a society, of its systems of power and its ideas of law, unless we have a very clear idea of what we're going to replace them with. And of course, as I hear all these cries for changes and reform and defunding our legal systems, I'm not hearing anything very clear in terms of what are we supposed to fill that power void with. What are we supposed to establish our security with? How is our society supposed to continue without these structures? It is a bit concerning. See, one of the things that I have often reflected upon is whenever we are presented with something, whether it is simply philosophical or political, which suggests that we can take all of American society and subdivide it into two categories. And it really is irrelevant if these two categories are black or white, if they are rich or poor, if they are educated versus simple, if it is urban versus rural, if it is male versus female. Regardless of what these two categories are that are established, as soon as this idea says you have these two groups, and one group can very easily be labeled the victim class, and the other can very clearly be labeled the villainous oppressive class, what you effectively have is a re-presentation of Marxist philosophy. What you are fundamentally back to is the old communist doctrine of the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, or the haves versus the have-nots. It's just being repackaged. It's just being represented. And if they ever say that all of history is simply a recorded concept of the power struggle between these two groups, it's Marxism. That's what it is. Now, there may very well be some truth to this. We do know that there has been victimization, there has been oppression, there has been unfair aspects of American history. And I will own that. I will say that that has happened, and it is a regrettable aspect of our history as Americans in this country. But when we make all these calls, one of the things that we should be conscious of is that in Marxist doctrine, strictly speaking, he said the entire old system had to be torn down. It had to be torn down in terms of its government. It had to be torn down in terms of its laws. It had to be torn down in terms of its ideas of the economy, and in particular, it had to be torn down in terms of its ethics. And if we look with a bit of scrutiny at some of the modern claims that are being made by some of these protest groups, they call for some very radical changes to our society, especially in regards to ethics. Calls for the destruction of the nuclear family, for uprooting the foundations of American values. These are things they're openly advocating for. And of course, when they say they want to tear down our accepted values, while they may not be saying it, my suspicion is what they really mean is Judeo-Christian values. They want to tear down the values upon which the entire Western world was built. Now, we have to be frank. When it comes to the Judeo-Christian ethic, we as Americans, we as descendants of Western civilization, and we as Christians have always been much better about holding up these ethics as an ideal than about actually living them out. But I think we should give pause. Because while the claims are being made that these ethical systems need to be torn down because they have never really been able to elevate these concepts of the true brotherhood of humanity, of the equality of all persons, regardless of what race or ethnicity or class they came from, at least in terms of dignity, these claims have never been perfectly lived out in Christian society. They have never been perfectly lived out in Christendom. This is true. Of course, I would also make the claim that you'll never find anywhere, in any section of the world, at any point in history, where they have been truly perfectly lived out. Have we had our failings and faults? Yes. This is largely the result of this incredible wound within the human heart that we as Christians would attribute to the doctrine of original sin. It is not really because of a culture. It is not really because of a mindset. It is not because of a privileged economic condition. The truth of the matter is that unaided by the grace of God, humanity ultimately turns on itself. It turns on itself sometimes in the most horrendous ways. And when I hear these claims that we need to tear down Western civilization, that we need to tear down this entire concept of the American system, and by implication, that we need to tear down Judeo-Christian ethics, because the Judeo-Christian ethic has never completely, perfectly upheld these ideas and values, it gives me an incredible hesitation. Because what they are doing is they are fundamentally claiming that there are certain goods that are so self-evident that we have no historical justification for not living them out perfectly. The idea that all men are on some level of equal dignity, of equal value, that they all matter within our society, and that they all should be cherished within our society. This, they fundamentally say, is a self-evident truth that cannot be doubted and should never have been compromised. See, where they start to lose me is the entire reason that we have concluded this is because of the Judeo-Christian ethic. Where do we find the foundation for all people are equal? Where do we find the foundation for all people are the subject of rights? Where do we find the foundation for the idea that it is wrong for one group of persons to oppress or try to manipulate another? We fundamentally find it, philosophically, in the notion, as our founding documents in this country have said, that all men have been created and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, given to them by God. Without this philosophical underpinning, it doesn't take humanity too long to start thinking, why should we hold all men to be equal? Why should we presume that they are all the subject of rights, or at least the same rights? Why should we attribute dignity to all of them? Especially when it seems that some seem to rise to prominence in society while others don't. See, this is a concerning thing, because whether they realize it or not, their entire philosophy seems to be almost self-cannibalistic. It's much like the old pagan emblem of the snake eating its tail. If we tear down the Judeo-Christian ethic, because it has never been able to establish in practice the true equality and the true fraternity of all humanity, but in doing so we tear down the very framework by which we have concluded that, how long will it be before we tear down the structures of our society, before we tear down our ethics, before we tear down our entire legal system, only to find that perhaps something far more frightening has taken its place? That whatever rises up into power in replacement of what we have destroyed is somehow far more manipulative, far more oppressive, and far more cruel than what we currently have. Do we need reform? Perhaps we do. Should we be advocates for justice? Absolutely. Should we promote the concept of fairness and decency and equality amongst all people of all ethnic groups and all colors and all stripes within our society? Yes, we should. But let's always analyze these extremist claims. Let's analyze them closely. For if we tear down everything that we have learned to be foundational and fundamental, and what we have determined is good and decent and true in our society, if we throw out the Lord in some attempt to try to refashion a society according to the perfect image of the ideals of man, we might realize we've really pulled out the entire framework of every good idea that we think we are trying to protect. So let us think on these things and think on them well. Let us keep one another in prayer. Let us pray that peace does return at some point in the very near future. Until then, let us hold all these thoughts within our hearts. Let's consistently bring them back to the Lord. So may God watch over you, may God bless you, and may God love you. Amen.